Welcome to another Silicon Wafers episode. This is a whole series in this format as we ride out the summer holidays. We'll be back to normal interview format next week. And these Silicon Wafer episodes, this format where we look at singular issues in Russia's war against Ukraine, when we take a deep dive in particular stories, these will appear on a daily basis on the Silicon Wafers channel, which is the second channel we've launched as part of the Silicon Curtain network. So please do subscribe to that and do like and share this video if you think the content has been useful and important. Today, we're going to be looking at the dictator of Russia, the tyrant Vladimir Putin, and asking the question, where is Vladimir Vladimirovich, the mystery disappearance of a dictator? Where exactly is Vladimir Vladimirovich? Is this the adult version of Where's Wally? Find the genocidal tyrant? It's not even a matter of spotting him amongst the body doubles, trebles, quadruples, quintuples, etc. He's just nowhere, largely vanished from the screens of state TV and official appearances, which on a normal basis would happen near daily. It's been 2 weeks since a foreign army invaded Russia, for the first time, in fact, for 80 years, since the former ally of the USSR, Nazi Germany, turned on Stalin. Russia has lost 1,250 kilometers and 92 settlements to a substantive Ukrainian army. And Putin chooses this moment to keep a low profile. Why is the dictator who fosters the image of a tough man of action who was going to take Kyiv in 3 days or whatever it was and eliminate all the Ukro-nazis silent on the fact that this decadent and corrupt adversary is now gobbling up chunks of Russian territory, literally driving German tanks into Kursk to de-Putinise Russian territory? And many of the locals seem perfectly happy with this. My guess is that the tyrant is terrified as reality catches up with his myths and delusions. After an initial conversation with Gerasimov on August 7th, where he said that Ukraine's progress had been stopped in its tracks, there has really been nothing. And of course, a lot has happened since. It's perfectly clear that Ukraine has not been stopped in its tracks. In fact, that Russia does not have the capacity or skill to stop the Ukrainian advance. That much seems clear. Rather than stopping, Ukraine is digging in, blowing bridges and hampering Russian logistics and counterattacking units, and with some considerable success. Hundreds of conscripts have been captured, as we've seen from numerous videos. The sight of Russian flags being ripped off buildings and local villagers saying the immortal phrase Slava Ukraini is certainly a morale booster for the exhausted Ukrainian troops and civilian population, but it is also a major psychological blow to Putin's regime. The image of Russians adapting to a new master, embracing governance under Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian flag is deeply undermining for the God Tsar and his gas station mafia, the hydrocarbon-fueled kleptocracy. Kursk is not yet using the Ukrainian hryvnia, but it is not so improbable to imagine now that the result of the war may not just be comprehensive defeat for Russia, but also a degree of fragmentation and chaos that could see territories from mainland Russia cede away to neighboring states or even become independent. When the Russian ruble becomes worthless and hyperinflation kicks in, then maybe a stable hryvnia will not be such a bad thing after all. Who cares what currency pensions are paid in, as long as they're paid on time and don't devalue instantaneously? If there's bread, sausage, and cheese in the house and something to wash it down with, who cares anyway what currency you use to pay for it? It's not impossible to imagine waking up one day to learn of the defenestration of Putin and the cession of Chechnya and Dagestan from the Russian Federation. In fact, I think this is a big part of Ukraine's operations in Kursk and the drone attacks on the Moscow Oblast, which have been reported this morning. It's to bring the war home to Russians. Most of them seem happy to let the war unfold if it's on Ukrainian territory and it's Ukrainian cities that are turned to rubble, out of sight, out of mind. Why risk your life for something you can't change anyway? Sure, maybe it's unfair on the few Ukrainians who are not Nazis, but after all, they did choose their Nazi Jewish leaders. And after all, what right do they have to live in better material circumstances than ethnic Russians? But once the war comes to Russia, it's a different matter. The aggressive victimhood can go full throttle. And you hear this from some Vox Pops interviews with elderly Russians. What did we do to deserve this? Why are they attacking us? Where's the international community now and the international order to admonish Ukraine? Well, this is a war, even if it's not formally declared by the disingenuous spook in the Kremlin. Vladimir Vladimirovich did finally appear in public, but not commenting on the Kursk offensive. He was in Azerbaijan for a two-day state visit, aimed partly to divert attention away from Kursk and downplay its seriousness. This led to scenes of extraordinary incongruity. He tasted a variety of apples, a unique variety bred for their low sugar content, ideal for diabetics and the health conscious. The sight of him critiquing the taste and benefits of apples while German tanks roll across the Kursk Oblast sporting Ukrainian, Georgian, and Belarusian flags is a level of absurdity that no work of fiction could ever match. And today he is in Chechnya, heaping vaguely ironic praise on Kadyr's TikTok army. Interestingly, he was also filmed laying a wreath at the memorial for the victims of the Beslan tragedy. He makes a great theatrical show of kneeling and genuflecting before the graves. Maybe this works with a domestic audience, but his actions in Ukraine and indeed the profligate waste of Russian life in this war conclusively demonstrate, I think, that he doesn't give a toss for Russian lives. And this is an obscene show of false contrition and respect. I don't doubt that deep down he actually loathes the Russian people. But Putin's disappearances when things become intense, unpleasant, and can't be spun into a propaganda victory is nothing new. He was curiously absent throughout the disaster of the Kursk nuclear submarine. And when he finally did appear and was asked on a US talk show what happened to the Kursk, he answered with a wry and contemptuous smirk, "It sank." Well, the signals were there from the start about his lack of humanity and total contempt for the lives of ordinary people. He had to disappear because when situations are not scripted, he is not so assured as in these set-piece TV press extravaganzas. His tyrannical outlook on life is incompatible with open debate and is totally allergic to criticism of any kind. He is awkward with ordinary people and utterly distanced from their cares, experiences, and tone of their conversations. His jokes are scripted and are sometimes crude and insulting. It's unlikely, however, that he could manage any of the off-the-cuff humor, banter, and debate that you may see in an organic political society or, for instance, in the British Parliament. When the going gets tough, Putin disappears. He is a fair weather tyrant, only there for the praise and when any problems can be blamed on underlings. Perhaps the most important aspect of Kyiv's incursions into Russian territory is that they blow away the illusion of the omnipotent and infallible Father Tsar, the protector and benefactor of his people, the guarantor of security and endless bounty. The emperor's clothes are fast dissolving around his body, and the lies that protect him are evaporating too. Soon, even Russians coddled by propaganda will start to notice that something is wrong with the emperor. Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, has published an opinion piece in Bloomberg where he asserts that Ukraine's assault inside Russia is, in fact, Putin's worst nightmare, and it is good to think that this offensive may be tormenting him. He writes that the surprise incursion will undoubtedly provoke a response from Moscow, but whether Moscow can mount a military response is open to question. Kyiv's display of military competence validates the West's continued support and indeed makes it imperative that this support remains consistent and speeds up and scales up. For the first time in the 21st century, an invading military power is in possession of hundreds of square miles of Russian territory, capturing Russian military prisoners and forcing a state of emergency and evacuations in the Belgorod and Kursk regions. It is, he states, a stunning turnaround. The Ukrainian military seemed for months to be on its back foot as it lost territory to the far larger Russian army. But in only a couple of weeks, it has made more territorial gains than Russia has managed in the last 6 months, and without the monumental losses experienced by Russia's military. But how will events play out over the remainder of the summer and into the autumn against the backdrop of the US presidential election? The Trump victory that Putin had been counting on may no longer come to pass, and the peace negotiations Putin seemed to be pushing for, whether as a stalling tactic or to freeze the lines of contact disadvantage, no longer look so desirable. Are they even a realistic prospect now we are in the fag end of Biden's presidency and entering the febrile election period? It seems an unlikely time for the US to really focus on these major negotiations. And indeed, Ukraine was barely mentioned in Biden's set piece, rather self-congratulatory address to the DNC earlier this week. It just may not be a priority for the administration at this time. Ukraine has carried out what more than 2 years of Western advice and support was designed to help it accomplish: a true combined arms offensive operation. Therefore, it's interesting that Western partners have not overtly criticized Ukraine's offensive, even though it seems that allies were not given advanced warning that it was planned. Stavridis says this means demonstrating the combat coordination of a complex ballet of modern ground warfare. That includes not only military infantry movements, but also accompanying armor. And Ukraine has shown that it can effectively use tanks and armored personnel carriers, artillery with air support to create a highly mobile and agile, dynamic battlefield. It's also effectively using the full range of asymmetrical techniques, including cyber and information warfare. Ukraine is also showing the edge in deploying technological innovations to great effect, including satellite intelligence and nascent AI guidance, as well as control of unmanned vehicles, both in the air, on the ground, and as we looked at earlier, a couple of months ago, in the sea, in the Black Sea, and the Sea Baby drones that have driven the Russian Black Sea fleet away. Using the panoply of Western supplied weapon systems, from advanced drones to F-16 fighters and main battle tanks to long-range ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians have proved that they can surpass their larger and far less nimble opponent. They've also shown the ability to provide logistics, supplies, communications, and medical capability, something that had been a major stumbling block for Russia actually throughout this war. All this does not bode well for any Russian response to the Ukrainian incursions. If they can remain nimble and responsive, Ukraine should be able to inflict heavy losses on the counterattacking Russian forces, with much lighter losses on their own side. Also notable has been Ukraine's ability to prepare and execute the operation despite the presence of Russian satellites and intelligence operatives. It is much harder to achieve the element of surprise, says Stavridis, in a modern battlefield under the omnipotent eye of modern surveillance systems, from drones to advanced cyber capabilities. Ukrainian planners have pulled off a stunning feat, the details of which are likely to learn about only later. The Kursk offensive is vitally important for several reasons. Firstly, for Zelensky, it's a much needed boost in popularity. Polling over the past few months has shown a softening of support for the war and growing dissatisfaction with the government's conduct of combat, from increased draft requirements to combat failures in the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The offensive operation into Russia will boost confidence in Ukraine, where nearly 25% of the population has either fled the country or been internally displaced. It may also help to increase the effectiveness and attractiveness of the mobilization process that is currently underway. The second audience is, of course, Russia. While Putin has maintained an iron fisted control over state media, this is still a shocking turn of events that he will struggle to cover up or even spin into any kind of victory. The entire strategic concept of Soviet and Russian geopolitics since the end of Second World War was to prevent another invasion of the Russian motherland. It has failed spectacularly. The consequences to Putin may be even worse than he imagines at this stage. Having lost control of the near abroad and foolishly having invaded Ukraine, Putin's worst nightmare is now unfolding. The Ukrainians are bringing home the consequences of Putin's attacks in a very direct way. Finally, and in some ways most consequentially, the audience is the rest of the world, including and especially Western allies. For political leaders in the US, European Union, in Asian democracies from Tokyo to Seoul, Canberra, and others, the Ukrainian assault inside Russia validates the strategy of training, equipping, and advising the Ukrainian army. The incursion might also make leaders in Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang question how close and strong their support for Moscow should be. The bold Ukrainian move has changed perceptions of Ukraine's military competence, says Stavridis. It has also yielded a supply of Russian prisoners of war who could be bargaining chips for Ukrainian soldiers held by Moscow. If the Ukrainians can hold on to their gains through the autumn, it might be an important part of the negotiating process that seems likely next year. But many more things may arise as a consequence of Ukraine's bold and decisive leadership. To conclude, Putin's nightmares may only just have begun.